The winter of 171-172 AD hit the Danube with a bite of ice that seemed to reflect political reality. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent his 10th consecutive winter away from Rome, in a residence that was not a palace but the headquarters of an endless war. Carnuntum, in Upper Pannonia, was the beating, laboring heart of the Roman war effort. A city of wood and legionaries, enveloped in the smoke of braziers and the constant swarm of couriers, blacksmiths, and bureaucrats. The humid air of the great river brought with it not only the cold, but the weight of previous years, a terrible toll that weighed on every decision. The year that had just ended, 171, had not brought the hoped-for turning point. After a momentary and fragile truce, the incursions of the Marcomannic, Quadine, and Sarmatian tribes resumed with ferocious determination. The news, as dry as military reports, spoke of profound devastation in the Danube provinces, of villages reduced to ashes, of entire populations kidnapped and dragged across the river. The worst of humiliations resonated in one word: Aquileia. The great port city, gateway to Italy, had been threatened, perhaps besieged. For the first time in centuries, the shadow of the barbarian had stretched across Italian soil, undermining the myth of the inviolability of the heart of the empire. The Pax Romana, in those regions, was a distant memory, replaced by a chronic insecurity that drained resources and wore down souls. The army that Marcus Aurelius found under his command at the dawn of 172 was a changed organism, shaped by necessity. The traditional legions, heavy and methodical war machines, had revealed themselves vulnerable to the elusive tactics of the Germanic warriors: very rapid coups, ambushes in the forests, refusal of pitched battle unless under conditions of overwhelming advantage. The lesson had been learned at a cost. For this reason, in the winter months, we worked tirelessly not only to repair the equipment, but to rebalance the forces. The light cavalry corps increased, often recruited from the same Balkan populations accustomed to that type of guerrilla warfare. Archers from the eastern provinces multiplied. They organized themselves into special units, the numbers, groups of auxiliaries with specific abilities: Dalmatian explorers, Balearic slingers, Moretan knights. Even the core of the army, the legionary infantry, adapted. Perhaps slightly lighter armor for greater mobility, training that insisted on speed of deployment and the ability to fight in more flexible formations. And at the center of it all, the Praetorian Guard and the Equites Singulars Augusti, the emperor's mounted escort, elite presences whose morale was a direct mirror of that of their lord. But an army, no matter how reformed, is a helpless colossus without a system to feed and move it. Here the real, cyclopean work of that winter unfolded: logistics. Thousands of men and horses had to be fed every day. The war machines, the ballistae and the onagers, required specific lumber and projectiles. Blacksmiths consumed mountains of iron for horseshoes, nails, blades, and arrowheads. All this river of material had to flow towards the Danube against every obstacle. The bulk arrived by sea, across the Adriatic, to the emporiums of the Dalmatian coast, and from there, on ox carts, through the bumpy roads of the Dinaric Alps, a journey of weeks exposed to bad weather and bandits. The most direct route, the river route, was the most crucial. The Classis Danubii, the Danube flotilla, was strengthened with new cargo and patrol boats. They went up and down the great river, becoming the vital arteries of the army, transporting grain from Pannonia, wine from Italy, timber from the Carpathians. Each landing place was a place of frenetic activity, where the army's quartermasters, the logistikoi whose role was often more decisive than that of a centurion, kept meticulous records on waxed tablets, noting every bushel of grain, every amphora of oil, every sack of nails. It was a war fought on the books before on the battlefield. And in the distance, from the mists of the left bank of the Danube, fragmentary and disturbing news arrived. The Marcomanni and the Quadi, strengthened by the forced retreat of the Romans the previous year, were reorganizing themselves. Their villages, it was whispered, teemed with warriors. Tribes made new alliances. The loot raided from the provinces gave them unexpected resources. Winter was only an apparent truce, a moment in which both sides, separated by the frozen river, forged weapons for the clash that everyone knew would come with the thaw. In Carnuntum, by the light of oil lamps, Marcus Aurelius wrote not only to his procurators, but perhaps also to his meditations, seeking in Stoic philosophy not an escape, but the strength of mind to bear the immense weight of an empire in danger and the responsibility of leading its recovery. The year 172 opened like this, in the silence full of omens of a frozen frontier. The thaw of 172 AD brought to the Danube not only the roar of shattering ice, but also the clear sound of a strategy taking shape. Marcus Aurelius, from Carnuntum, no longer looked at the border as a line to be defended, but as a starting point. The objective for the new campaign was not a simple retaliation, a flick of the tail of the wounded beast. It was the systematic reconquest of security, a surgical operation to eradicate the Marcomannic threat from its own territory. The philosopher's thoughts were transformed into military plans of ruthless precision. It was a question of restoring the dominion of Rome not with raids, but with occupation, control, the physical and undeniable presence of the eagles across the river. This vision materialized in an enormous work of engineering and discipline. The Danubian limes, for years a passive and violated barrier, became a nervous, reactive organism. From Castra Regina in northern Rhaetia to the fortresses of Lower Pannonia such as Bregetio, a chain of fire and signals ran. Stone watchtowers gradually replaced the wooden structures, manned day and night by sentries whose eyesight was trained to detect the slightest movement on enemy banks. Among the main forts, there were smaller burghs, blockhouses for auxiliary cohorts, and a dense network of patrols, both land and river. The classis Danuvii was no longer just a transportation service. His light and fast Liburnians traveled along the river in continuous patrol, their eyes scanning the natural landing places, the inlets, the tracks that descended from the north towards the water. The Danube itself, from an obstacle to be looked at, became a guarded military avenue, a backbone along which the power of Rome flowed. At the same time, the army underwent a final metamorphosis, the definitive adaptation to a war that did not resemble any conflict against the Parthians or in Britain. The structure of the legion remained the pillar, but its use and context changed radically. The vexellations, temporary detachments taken from the legions for specific tasks, multiplied, an unprecedented organizational flexibility. Cavalry wings, especially those of light cavalry such as the Mauri or the Dalmati, became the key element for in-depth reconnaissance and pursuit of the fleeing enemy. The emperor himself, aware of the symbolic and material value of his guard, strengthened his equites singulars Augusti, selecting the best knights of the empire, and kept the praetorians at his side, no longer just bodyguards but an elite intervention reserve. But the most profound change was perhaps in doctrine. The manuals of Frontinus and Vegetius were studied not to learn rigid patterns, but to adapt them. Troops were trained to form defensive squares quickly, to march in combat order in wooded territories, to build a fortified camp, castrum, in a few hours, even after a day of marching or fighting. Marcus Aurelius' army was transforming into a hybrid machine, capable of the iron discipline of heavy infantry, but also of the reactivity and mobility necessary to flush out an evanescent enemy. Every soldier, from the legionary to the Thracian knight, knew that the upcoming campaign would not be a triumphal walk, but a slow, methodical penetration into a hostile and unknown world, where danger could materialize from any clearing. Spring advanced, and with it the tension in the Roman camps became palpable, filled with an expectation that was no longer passive, but offensive. The plan was ready. The sword was sharp. We were just waiting for the moment, and perhaps a sign, to take action. It was in this climate of meticulous preparation that an extraordinary event, soon shrouded in the aura of a miracle, provided the propaganda spark and perhaps the moral turning point of the first phase of the campaign. In the late spring of 172, a large Roman force, perhaps a plurilegionary vexillatio or perhaps an entire legion identified by later sources as the 12th Fulminata, found itself in very serious difficulty during an operation in Quado or Marcomannian territory. The precise tactical circumstances are lost, but the core of the story is clear. The Romans, surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, found themselves in an arid area, without water, under the scorching sun of northern Pannonia or the Moravian plains. The situation was desperate. Dehydration and heat would weaken the men faster than enemy swords. It is at this point that contemporary sources, such as Tertullian and Dio Cassius, record the extraordinary episode. According to the story, while the legionaries, thirsty and exhausted, resisted the siege, Marcus Aurelius, perhaps informed by smoke signals or couriers on horseback, invoked divine help. In response, a storm of unprecedented fury suddenly broke out from the clear sky. The rain came down in sheets, quenching the thirst of the Roman troops and allowing them to fill their waterskins. But the miracle had a decisive war impact. Bad weather, perhaps hail or lightning, hit the barbarian camp with savage violence, sowing panic and terror among horses and warriors. The Romans, reinvigorated, seized the moment to launch a sortie, breaking the encirclement and putting the shocked enemy to flight. The historian must separate the core fact from the legend. It is very plausible that a Roman formation was surrounded and that a violent summer storm, frequent in those regions, influenced the outcome of the clash. The brilliance of the imperial propaganda machine transformed a meteorological event into a prodigium, a sign of heavenly favor. The Christian version of Tertullian, which attributes the miracle to the prayers of the Christian legionaries of the legion, and the pagan version, which spoke of the intervention of Jupiter Pluvius or the Egyptian god Hermes, Harpocrates, invoked by magicians following the emperor, coexist, indicating the immediate power of the story. Strategically, the episode, which went down in history as the miracle of the rain, or of the Thunderbolt Legion, had enormous consequences. For the Romans, it was tangible proof that the gods, indeed the numen of the emperor himself, fought alongside them. Morale, already recovering, reached very high peaks. For the barbarian coalitions, it was a terrible shock. Not only had their best troops been defeated, but the sky itself seemed to have sided with Rome. This event shattered the psychological unity of the Quadi and perhaps the Marcomanni, opening cracks in their resistance. Immediately afterwards, or perhaps at the same time, the Roman avant-gardes began to move with renewed confidence. Cavalry patrols explored the fords, light infantry detachments consolidated the bridgeheads across the Danube, testing the enemy defenses in a series of violent but limited skirmishes. Every clash, now, was read in the light of that divine sign. The legionaries advanced with the conviction of being invincible, while the German warriors faced those soldiers bathed in the celestial rain with a superstitious terror that weakened their arm. The initiative, after years of passivity, was firmly and irremediably in the hands of Marcus Aurelius. The river had been overcome, not only physically by the vanguards, but in the spirit of the entire army. The war of reconquest could begin in its decisive phase. With morale transformed into iron by the story of the miraculous rain, the bulk of the Roman army moved in the midsummer of 172. The crossing of the Danube was not an incursion, but a military procession of unprecedented power. From the main pontoon bridges set up near Carnuntum and perhaps Vindobona, the legions marched away for entire days. The metallic clang of the laricas, the rhythmic step of thousands of calligi on the wood, the neighing of the horses and the creaking of the carriages loaded with siege engines composed a symphony of deliberately ostentatious strength. It was a spectacle calculated to be seen. From the northern shores, frightened eyes of German explorers must have observed that river of steel and discipline that flowed inexorably into their world. Once beyond the great river, the Roman strategy revealed itself in its methodical determination. It was not a question of chasing fleeing hordes, but of reconquering the territory inch by inch, suffocating any possibility of organized resistance. The legions advanced like a monumental hammer, following the main river valleys that penetrated the heart of Marcomannic Bohemia, perhaps going up the course of the Morava River. The day's march was an immutable ritual. At dawn the dismantling of the camp, the march in combat order with the cavalry and the velites protecting the flanks, and then, before sunset, the construction of the castrum, the fortified night camp. Every evening a square citadel with moat, palisade and guard towers was born out of nothing, a daily affirmation of order in the chaos of barbarism. Roman tactics in this phase were a masterpiece of coordination between the different weapons. The heavy legionary infantry constituted the gravitational center, the pivot around which the entire machine revolved. It advanced in compact formations, implicitly inviting the enemy to attack frontally, the clash that the Germans traditionally avoided. But when the Marcomanni, driven by desperation or pride, decided to strike that apparently slow blockade, the trap was triggered. The wings of the Roman and auxiliary cavalry, kept distant and mobile, then converged on the flanks of the barbarian formation. At the same time, the numbers of light infantry, archers and slingers, who had preceded the legion by hiding in the difficult terrain, emerged to target the enemy rearguards. It was a war of strategic attrition. The clashes may not have been large pitched battles with memorable names, but a series of violent and decisive engagements at fords, forced passes and crossroads of tracks. In these actions, the value of Marcus Aurelius' generals became fundamental. Men like Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, the emperor's Syrian son-in-law, demonstrated not dazzling genius but tenacity, the ability to manage composite forces and maintain discipline in fluid scenarios. Marco Valerio Massimiano, a proven veteran of the frontier, was sent where the resistance was fiercest. Publio Elvio Crispino, prefect of the camp, was the dark architect of the logistics that allowed these columns to push further and further away from the Danube without collapsing. None of them was a Caesar. They were the solid, indispensable cornerstones on which the emperor's strategy was based. Their skill lay in perfectly executing a plan conceived elsewhere, in translating Marcus Aurelius' will into movement and blood. And while the legions advanced, behind them, like a protective shadow, the chain of outposts along the river remained, now stronger than ever, to ensure that the vital bridge with the Roman world was never severed. The Roman advance, similar to a vice that tightened with slow implacability, necessarily had to culminate in a decisive clash. The sources remain silent on the name of a specific place, but military logistics and archaeological evidence of Roman camps deep in the Bohemian hinterland suggest that the summer of 172 saw a major confrontation, perhaps in the Ore Mountains region on the border between modern-day Bohemia and Bavaria, a rich and strategically vital area for the Marcomanni. Here, probably, the main forces of the tribe, realizing that infinite retreat was equivalent to collapse, prepared to do battle. Perhaps they chose apparently favorable terrain, a wide valley in which to deploy their mass of warriors, with their flanks protected by bushes or gentle slopes. They faced the Roman legion with the desperate courage of those who defend the land of their ancestors. The ensuing clash was not an ambush, but the classic, terrible frontal collision that Rome had perfected over centuries of conquests. The legionaries, lined up in triple line, received the initial impact, absorbing the barbarian fury behind the barrier of their large shields. The clamor was deafening, the metal against the wood of the German shields, the war cries, the commands shouted by the centurions. 4 hours, the battle teetered on brutal balance. Roman tactics, however, played on attrition. While the first line engaged the enemy, the second and third lines provided a constant supply of fresh men. And it was from one side, perhaps from the one that the Marcomanni believed to be safe, that the turning point came. A vexillatio of cavalry, perhaps the same equites singulars or an auxiliary wing held in reserve, managed to carry out a large outflanking maneuver, emerging behind the German deployment. Panic, that contagious terror that had already undermined morale after the rain episode, spread like a wave. Seeing its rearguards attacked, the Marcomannic line lost cohesion and broke into isolated nuclei of resistance which were systematically crushed. The retreat turned into rout, and the rout into massacre. The Romans, disciplined even in victory, pursued only up to a pre-established limit, instead consolidating control over the field. The consequences were immediate and irrevocable. The Marcomanni suffered a total military and political defeat. Huge losses of warriors, the core of their fighting force, deprived them for years of the ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. The Roman camp became the center of the new power. Rivers of prisoners were brought here, including, humiliatingly for a warrior society, women, children, and the elderly. But even more significant was the liberation of thousands of Roman prisoners, civilians taken from the provinces during the years of raids, now emaciated and distraught, who returned under the protection of the eagles. This moment, filled with intense pathos, was perhaps the greatest moral triumph of the campaign. Marcus Aurelius imposed very harsh conditions. He didn't just ask for tribute in livestock or grain. He demanded hostages of royal blood, the sons of leaders and kings, to be brought to Rome as a living guarantee of future loyalty. He imposed the delivery of contingents of young warriors to be enlisted as auxiliaries in the Roman army, a continuous drain of life force. Above all, he prohibited any permanent settlement in the lands immediately north of the Danube, creating a depopulated buffer zone controlled by his outposts. The main antagonist, the Marcomanno people, was not annihilated, but reduced to vassal status, politically castrated and militarily emasculated. The balance of power on the Middle Danube had changed forever. With the Marcomann power broken, the center of gravity of the war moved eastwards, into the area of influence of the Quadi. This tribe, traditional allies of the Marcomanni but with perhaps a more fragmented internal political dynamic, had observed the fate of their neighbor with growing horror. The campaign against them, in the late summer and early autumn of 172, took on different characteristics. The Quado territory, flatter and crossed by rivers such as the Va, perhaps the Cuius vaguely mentioned in the sources, favored a war of movement and ambushes. Here, the heavy legionary infantry, triumphant in pitched battles, risked becoming a clumsy giant. The Roman response was a masterly combined use of riverine and cavalry forces. The classis Danubii became an offensive weapon. Small flotillas sailed up the southern tributaries of the Danube, transporting light infantry units for rapid incursions into the enemy rear, destabilizing settlements and intercepting barbarian supply lines. The decisive battle against the Quadi, if we can speak of a pitched battle, probably took place near an important ford or a river confluence. The Quadi, trying to block the Roman advance, lined up on the opposite bank of a watercourse, trusting in their superiority in mobility and knowledge of the terrain. It was then that Marcus Aurelius, or more likely his legate in the field, demonstrated brilliant tactical adaptation. Instead of attempting a frontal crossing under a hail of javelins and arrows, a substantial part of the Roman cavalry, perhaps reinforced by units of heavy cataphractaria cavalry of Oriental or Sarmatian origins, was made to undertake a forced night march to find a ford upstream or downstream. At dawn, while the Roman infantry simulated preparations for the crossing, holding the attention of the Quadi, the mass of armored knights fell on the flank of the enemy formation. The impact of the cataphractarii, a storm of iron and flesh, must have been an apocalyptic spectacle. Men and horses entirely covered in metal scales, practically invulnerable to the Germans' light jet weapons, which overwhelmed everything in their path. The disbandment was inevitable, and the Roman infantry, having crossed the now unprotected river, completed the work. The military defeat of the Quadi was only the prelude to an equally crucial diplomatic phase, where Marcus Aurelius demonstrated that he also mastered the art of subtle command. He did not apply to the Quadi the same, very harsh conditions automatically imposed on the Marcomanni. Instead, he adopted a differentiated strategy, further shattering tribal cohesion. The leaders and factions who submitted quickly and unconditionally received relatively mild treatment, the return of Roman prisoners, the delivery of symbolic hostages, the promise of providing auxiliary contingents. Those who persisted in even verbal resistance were hit with exemplary severity. Their villages set on fire, their leaders captured or killed, their followers dispersed or sold into slavery. This carrot and stick policy, applied with cold determination, produced the desired effect. Delegations of Quadi leaders, dressed in mourning according to their custom, began to reach the emperor's headquarters to beg for peace. Marcus Aurelius received them not as an equal, but as an unappealable judge, listening to their pleas in silence, before dictating the final conditions. The most significant of these was perhaps the sending of a quadra embassy to Rome, to confirm the treaty of submission directly to the Senate. This gesture, full of symbolism, publicly sanctioned the tribe's new status as clientele and brought the news of the Danube victory to the heart of the city. As the first autumn mists rose from the plains of Slovakia, the Quad threat had also been put to rest. The sword had led the way, but it was the calculated mix of strength and diplomacy that sealed the victory. The victory over the tribes, obtained with the sword and ratified by diplomacy, did not constitute an end in itself for the strategic mind of Marcus Aurelius. The autumn of 172 AD therefore became the season of consolidation, of the irreversible imprint of Rome on those territories torn away from barbaric chaos. The emperor ordered the construction of a network of military outposts north of the Danube, not simple seasonal camps but semi-permanent structures of wood and earth, sometimes on previously occupied German sites. These garrisons, located at key points such as the mountain passes of the Sumava, the river confluences or the main fords, were not intended to administer a province, but to control. From these advanced fortresses, cavalry patrols patrolled the territory, preventing the return of unauthorized settlements and monitoring the movements of subjugated tribes. They were the eyes and claws of the Roman eagle, reaching out into a territory that remained formally barbaric, but in fact under the military dominion of the empire. At the same time, the southern bank of the Danube experienced a building frenzy unprecedented in the crisis years. The limes was rebuilt and enhanced with obsessive care. Auxiliary forts such as those of Canabiaca, Zeiselmauer, or Alla Nova, Schwechat, saw their wooden palisades replaced by thick stone walls and masonry corner towers. The signal was clear: Rome would no longer retreat. This border was no longer the fragile curtain of the 1960s, but a bulwark designed to last centuries, based on defense in depth and a system of rapid communication between forts via smoke or fire signals. The army itself, shaped by the war, began to undergo an organic restructuring that reflected new geopolitical realities. The legions did not simply return to their home bases. The Second Italica, one of the units formed by Marcus Aurelius at the beginning of the wars, found its permanent headquarters in Lauriacum, Enns, in Naricum, a very advanced position upstream from Vindobona, guarding the newly conquered access roads. It was an epochal transfer, which shifted the strategic weight of the border forward. The auxiliary units were reassigned with iron logic. The more mobile cavalry wings were deployed in the outposts across the river, while the infantry cohorts garrisoned the main forts of the limes. The practice of detaching vexillations from distant legions, which remained on the Danube for years, was consolidated, creating an almost permanent field army, a Danube army with its own identity and its own very high level of experience. Morale, after the triumphs of the summer, was solid, but a realistic awareness spread among the veterans and officers. The scars of battles, the memory of comrades who fell in the forests or during sieges, taught that the submission of the tribes was a contingent, revocable fact. They therefore prepared not for a return to a forgotten peace, but for endless vigilance. The warehouses of the forts were overflowing with grain, with piles, with arrows. Blacksmith shops worked at a rapid pace to repair armor. Training continued unabated, perfecting the new tactics of cooperation between infantry and cavalry. The approaching winter was not expected as a period of rest, but as a necessary pause to prepare the next move, whatever it might be. The victorious army of Marcus Aurelius was not disarming. It was fossilizing into a perfect and perpetually alert war machine, the guardian of a border that now, finally, seemed to be back under the control of Rome. The last operational weeks of 172 AD saw the Roman army perform a complex logistical and strategic ballet. The legions and auxiliaries did not return en masse behind the Danube, but were arranged according to a precise geometry of the force. Some units, especially the cavalry ones and the more experienced vexillations, remained garrisoned in the outposts across the river, consciously facing the unprecedented prospect of a barbaric winter in enemy land, an extreme sacrifice but deemed necessary to consolidate the presence. The bulk of the forces instead fell back towards the southern shore, not in temporary camps, but in the new or improved winter quarters in stone and wood that dotted the limes from Castra Regina to Brigesio. This repositioning was not a retreat, but the closing of a pincer. Military pressure remained constant on both sides of the river. At Carnuntum, Marcus Aurelius' Praetorium became the center not only of command, but also of the administration of justice and reward. The emperor received reports, listened to petitions from common soldiers and centurions, and presided over war councils for the coming year. His correspondence, some of which will filter into his memoirs, was to be exterminated. Instructions to the governors of the rear provinces, letters to the Senate, directives to the procurators for the management of the immense spoils of war, cattle, grain, amber, and above all slaves, thousands of them, who began to flow towards the markets of the empire. The balance of the year, on the eve of winter, was extraordinarily positive but not uncritical. From a military and political point of view, the result was crystal clear. The Marcomannic coalition had been shattered, the Quadi bowed to a client treaty. The Danube frontier, for the first time in a decade, was not a line of penetration for the barbarians, but a starting point for Rome. This success was immortalized and communicated to the world through the universal language of money. The imperial mint issued a series of aurei and denarii with the unequivocal legend, Germanius Bacta. On the reverse, the image of the emperor in military dress, his foot placed on the helmet of a defeated warrior, looked towards a trophy of Germanic weapons. It was the victory codified in a message to the Roman public opinion, hungry for good news. Added to this was the awarding of Marcus Aurelius with the victorious title of Germanicus, a name that carried echoes of past conquests and was now rekindled in the present. Yet, in the sober atmosphere of the winter headquarters, no one was under any illusions. The subjugation of the tribes was a contingent fact, born of terror and force. The Roman losses, although not quantified by the sources, had been huge. The army was tired, and the imperial treasury, despite the booty, had been drained by the years of war. The forward garrisons beyond the Danube were islands of order in an ocean of potential hostility. The war was not over, she had simply transformed. From a desperate conflict of survival, it had become a work of stabilization and control, perhaps even more complex and exhausting. The twilight of 172 AD fell on a transformed Danube. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher forced to be the soldier, could look back on the course of the year with the rare satisfaction of an objective achieved. Through a combination of meticulous preparation, tactical adaptation, brute force applied with discipline, and an appropriate dose of climatic luck elevated to a divine sign, he had turned the tide of a desperate war. He had regained not only the territory, but the strategic initiative and the myth of Roman invincibility. His legions, now a hardened and specialized Danubian army, garrisoned a hardened and forward-leaning border. The title of Germanicus was not empty rhetoric, but the seal on a year of blood and triumph. Yet, the real lesson of 172 lay not just in the victory, but in the revelation of the nature of this war. He had demonstrated that the border was no longer a line to be defended, but a region to be dominated, a living organism that required a permanent military presence, a constant drain of resources, and sleepless vigilance. The river, from a barrier, had become the artery of an empire in arms, and the man who peered into its dark waters from its bank knew that the sovereign's task was no longer just to govern, but to perpetually monitor the fragile frontier between the order of Rome and the chaos of the forests. The year ended not with a full stop, but with a semicolon in the long, epic struggle of the Marcomannic Wars.